Hello, welcome to our panel discussion. We are going to go ahead and start things out with Neil Trollope. He's going to do a summary of his lesson. And then after that, we're going to go ahead with the rest of the speakers. And this gives you guys an opportunity to ask questions and so forth. I give you Neil Trollope.
Amen. Thanks, Toma, and apologies again that wasn't able to join you earlier. But as Toma said, my lesson will be recorded, and hopefully you'll have a chance to look at that. So my lesson is a deep dive into Colossians 1, verse 24, which reads as follows: Paul writing, "Now I rejoice in what I am suffering for you, and I lift up in my flesh what is still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions, for the sake of his body, which is the church." Now, the Apostle Peter mentioned that some of Paul's writings are hard to understand. And I must admit that this verse, when I was a younger Christian, really didn't seem to make any sense to me. Paul seems to be saying that he seems to be suggesting that Christ's sacrifice, his dying on the cross, wasn't complete, and that in some way Paul felt he needed to complete the suffering that Jesus was spared. But of course, we know that can't be true because, Jesus, as he hung on the cross just before he died, he said, "It is finished." And in Hebrews chapter 10, we read that Jesus, as our high priest, made the perfect sacrifice once and for all, and he was able to sit down at the right hand of God. Now, in that culture, in the ancient Middle East, and certainly the temple culture, sitting down was a symbol of completion of a work, of a job. So Jesus clearly did complete, what he was sent to earth to come to do. So Paul clearly wasn't saying that in some way he needed to complete the finished work of Jesus. So what was Paul saying? And I think the answer is found in the ancient Middle East belief and tradition that what was true of the king was true of his people. Now, a great example of that, of course, is David and Goliath. You know the story. But the Philistines sent Goliath out, and he challenged the army of Saul to send somebody to fight against him, and the winner would then be the victory for that nation, for the army that he represented. We know how it ended. David went out there, he killed Goliath. What the Philistines didn't do then was to sort of resort to plan B, pick up their swords and their shields and charge at Saul's army. The defeat of Goliath, the king's representative, meant their defeat. They fled. And this is obviously true for us, as true for us as it was for them and as it was for Paul. What is true of our King Jesus is true of us. And, to summarize the life of Jesus, he led a life that was the way of the cross. His life led to, a death that was the ultimate selfless act of service. It was sacrificial. And Paul understood that he, as a follower of Jesus, was called to live the way of the cross. And it's the same for us. We are called as followers of Jesus to live a life of selfless, sacrificial service. When Paul was writing this, he was in a jail in Rome, as you might know. And I also think, as we really dig into this and look at the language, that Paul was pleased that he was drawing some attention away from the church. The Jewish leaders that might still have been following him and wanted him to be tried, as well as Rome, was focused on Paul. They had captured, the ringleader or one of the ringleaders of the early church. And Paul was happy that he was a kind of a decoy, and he was attracting persecution that perhaps saved the church some attention and suffering and afflictions. And I think the question for us is, what does this look like for us in our churches? There is affliction, and this word affliction, by the way, refers literally to a pressing. Paul said in his letter to the Corinthians that he was pressed on all sides, and we experience that. That's just part of the world we live in. It's a world of brokenness and it needs lots of healing. And Many people feel, pressed and pressurized. There's loss, there's sadness, there are feelings of abandonment, there's depression, there's oppression, there's not being listened to. And I think, that is the state of the world. And not only do we as Christians experience that in the world, but I think in the broader church movement, and I would suggest in our movement as well, that there are disciples, their brothers and sisters who are feeling afflicted. They're going through difficulties that perhaps the rest of us don't understand. And I think Paul calls us to imitate him as he imitated Christ, and to be there for our brothers and sisters, to share in their suffering and their afflictions. I don't have the time to tell the story fully, but let me just mention that when Otoma reached out to me and asked me to give this lesson, that was a week after we had a real tragedy in our church. Without going into the detail, a young boy whose mother is a member of our church drowned tragically in a swimming pool at a church event. You can imagine how that rocked the church. But the mom is such a faithful Christian. She obeyed God in coming to church regularly. Her husband wasn't happy with her coming, and so she was blamed for this. We were blamed for it. But how the church pulled together was really amazing. The way we organized the funeral, initially the family didn't want us to be involved, but we paid the costs of the funeral. Our members were there regularly, and just we shared in the afflictions of our sister. And at the end of all the prayer vigils, which are traditional, and the funeral, members of her family came up to our church members, and they had changed completely. They said they've just never experienced a group of people like this. And as Paul experienced joy, he said he experienced joy, really participating in the suffering and taking up the afflictions of the church. I felt a strange sense of joy that, we could help our sister and be a light. We provided comfort. We mourned with her. And the family has really turned around. They've turned changed the attitude towards the church. We're even reaching out to her husband. So it's just amazing. It's a miracle. It's God's work. And I think that's what happens when we do embrace opportunities to walk alongside and encourage our brothers and sisters who are going through really tough times, who've been pressed on all sides. So thank you for the opportunity to give that very brief summary of my lesson. Thanks, Otoma.
Thank you. That's so bittersweet just hearing that. But yeah, no, thank you for the lesson on the brief lesson on Christ's afflictions. We will get that out a full lesson out to everyone that registered for the conference in the next week or so. Right now, we can bring up the speakers, and we can have an opportunity for a Q&A. So Ben may still be joining us, and that's fine. I don't see any questions right now in the chat. So if you guys have questions, you can go ahead and add them. I do have a question for Mr. Michael Burns, and this probably would also be a question for Ben to a degree. When I went through, and this connects to the book Fish Kol Tov, and one of the things that was mentioned, and I think you mentioned something similar in your lesson, Michael, is just in reference to, everything should be about us. In other words, God is enough, right? And it doesn't matter if we're growing. It doesn't matter if, obviously, I think Ben mentioned we're not in this to get something from God, so to speak. And I think that makes perfect sense. So this almost seems like a paradigm shift in terms of how we should be thinking about spirituality, which at first, when I hear it, it sounds very healthy, right? In the sense of, it doesn't matter how things are going to a degree. And I guess, how does that look long term? Because it almost seems like, on the one hand, we're obeying the gospel, which is to, go and seek and save the lost. And I can just imagine, although we don't have, the old stats and so forth from back in the day, but there still is like, so, how's it going? And I think even you and I just discussed briefly about some of the churches around the world, and I mean, specifically Africa. It's like, well, things could be better in this part of the world, or what have you. So it's kind of a long question, but maybe you can kind of untangle that, and like, how should we be thinking about things, and so forth. So, Mr. Michael?
Sure. One of my years and years ago, I was in a class, and one of my professors broke us up into small groups and had us study and look at not just the ministry and life of Paul and John, but the next generation that came out of their ministries. And from Paul, you have all these great churches and leaders into the 2nd century. And from John, mostly the areas that he ministered in, you had struggle and hardship, and Gnosticism comes out of that region, and all sorts of things. And he asked the groups, who was more successful in ministry? And so we had like 20 minutes to sit there and discuss and come up with our answers. And then we came back, and every group tried to answer, and he let every group answer. And then finally he goes, you're all wrong, because it's the wrong question. Success in ministry, that's kind of a worldly question. Faithfulness is the right question. Are we being faithful? And so being faithful does not denote doing nothing, but it's a different type of activity. And I think if we have a success mindset, it leads towards outcome-based actions. Like, we got to get outcomes. We got to have this many new baptisms, and that means we got to reach out to this many people, and that means we got to have this many Bible studies. And those feel good, but those are, and I'm not saying that's always wrong, but I'm just saying it's very prone to problems, because it leads to outcomes, and then we control outcomes, so that gives us the control, and we feel like, hey, we can do this. Whereas I think what we see in the New Testament is a much heavier emphasis on fruit, which comes from God, which comes from the Spirit. And our role in that is simply to be faithful and be the grounds for the fruit to grow, right? Like, my wife loves to do these garden boxes in the back. It drives me nuts, because I'm like, we can just go to the store and buy all that stuff, because then I can control it. I can get what I want when I want. Boom. It's a much slower process to like stick stuff in the ground and, create the conditions for it to grow, but I can't control whether it grows or not. There's a lot of other factors. And so I think that's part of what we do, is create conditions for fruit to grow, fruit like goodness and kindness and patience and love. And when we work on those things, the other things come. God does the growth and the outcomes, but they might not always come. So what I'm trying to say is, simply a church that's doing a lot and growing a lot is not necessarily a sign of health. And a church that's not growing is not necessarily a sign of a lack of health. There's different factors going on. So there's more I could say to that, but I know there's a bunch of other brilliant people on the call, so I'll stop there.
Okay. No, thank you. Anyone else like to share on that perspective? Because I think that to me sounds very biblical and accurate. And I'm just wrestling in my head with, like, what does that look like? For example, you have a pastor, we'll use that term, right? Overseeing a congregation, and they have a leaders meeting, a servants meeting, however, whatever. And it's like, okay, so how was the week? So I think it's obviously about faithfulness, right? But I guess, Damon, thoughts? Any other?
Yeah, I was just going to say how well this goes along with the thought of why we practice spiritual disciplines. If we're
Mhm.
practicing spiritual disciplines as a benchmark for success, I prayed the right amount of times for the right length, or I read the right number of chapters, or spent the right number of minutes. I fasted frequently enough. If we're doing those things as a measure of success, we've got it backwards, as we mentioned earlier. Faithfulness, a desire, a passion for God draws us into those disciplines, and God is the reward. Being closer to God is the reward, not so much the results. But there's no way you're going to avoid fruitfulness the closer you get to God. Just like there's no way you're going to avoid being more formed by Christ the nearer you draw to him.
Yes. Kevin? Thank
Great
you.
to be with everybody, and I appreciated the comments just made, and also Michael's comments. Someone that obviously wrote a lot about this idea of abandoning outcomes, Dallas Willard, renovation of the heart, etc. And as we look at what Paul and John and others try to combat, it was worldly measures of success or status leaking into the church. So that's an obvious example of trying to, with success, bringing that sort of worldly metric into the church. So it just makes me think what Neil shared just a minute ago about ministering to a family who had just had this tragedy of this death and loss. And so his church leaning in, paying for the memorial service, paying for the funeral, and being the hands and feet of Jesus. And I mean, that how can you say that success? Your hearts are broken, their hearts are broken, and yet that is success. That is what Jesus would do, which is love the broken. And so in that sense, you can't put a worldly metric on Christ-like service in that situation. I would look at that as that's a God-honoring, faithful church doing Jesus' work by the power of the Spirit. So that would be success by any measure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know one thing, not that I totally understood the whole book, but Charles Taylor talks in The Secular Age that we've lost a lot of the enlightenment, or I forget the exact term he uses, that we're very secular and I do this and this is a result kind of a thing. And I know there's a question here from Simone. We'll get that to that in a second. But are there ways that you guys are working in your churches or so forth to highlight the Holy Spirit more and not be so man focused, I guess is the best way to put it?
Yeah, can I maybe respond, sir? I'm not sure how to put my hand up.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the comments so far are really helpful. And we're on a growth curve. I think we're just trying to get healthy as a church again, and we really enjoy. I enjoy the writings of John Mark Comer. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that, but I love the focus on just being with Jesus. And he emphasizes practice and discipline, which I think some people might be somewhat sensitive to as a work, but to just desire to be something or somewhere without putting in the practice really doesn't get one there. So we are starting that program of practicing the way of Jesus, just focusing on being with him. And as we spend time with Jesus, practicing the way he spent time with God, we will be transformed. And as we transformed into Jesus, we will do what Jesus did. And so I think as Michael and others have said, the outputs will come. I do think healthy churches will grow, but healthy churches need to be rooted in Christ and living as Jesus lived and prioritizing as Jesus prioritized. So we're trying to focus on that, being with God. Being with God is an end goal, but I think it's also a means to an end. Being with God enables transformation in us. We get restored in the image, we get transformed, and as we become more like Jesus, I think we will want to and will automatically do what Jesus did and do it the way he did it, do mission the way Jesus did. So we're just focusing on being with Jesus for the next year or two.
Thank you. Thank you. So a question from Simone is, how do we shed the tendencies of Rome in our hearts and relearn the ways of the Lamb as individuals, especially if we learn those things to protect ourselves and the church? And if we need elaboration, I guess we can get to that. But
Okay, I'll take a stab at that. I was waiting for somebody else to step up, but I figured some of that language seems to come from my lesson, so that would be weak if I didn't at least try to answer it.
I was just thinking that sounds escaping the beastish kind of.
I understand the first part of the question. I'm not sure if I fully understand if we learn those things to protect ourselves in the church. I'm not quite sure what she has in mind there.
Maybe defending ourselves in ways that are not lamb-like, I suppose.
Sure.
Using worldly ways, maybe. That's the best I can. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the $1 million question that Simone asks there. It's really good. To me, it's kind of the balance of Paul's writings is, it's almost like Jesus is his master chef, and then Paul is the waiter, the server that's bringing the meal and serving it. Like, how do we really put this into effect? And so he sees that it's a constant process of formation and transformation. I think that's behind what he says in Romans 12, when he's starting to say, how do we put this into practice? It's like, here's what your real worship is. It's offering your body as a living sacrifice. And this takes total transformation of the mind, because we grow blind. Just as a normal process, we grow blind to the inequities and injustices of the society around us, but it seems normal. So it becomes invisible, and we accept some of those things and even are willing to defend them because they brought some advantage to me over the years, personally, or what have you. And we often we know the dynamics of the world, the dynamics of power and success and those types of things. And so I think that's the whole purpose of a new creation community, is to reform. As Damon Ivy talked about, those spiritual disciplines, that's a lot of what they do is they're reforming who we are, how we think, how we react to things, how we carry ourselves as a people and a body. And the instincts of empire come so naturally, but that's each of Paul's letters in a different way. That's what he's doing, is he's getting them to examine ways that they have, embraced the culture of the world and now need to rethink that. And the last thing I'll say here is, I do think, and I hit a little bit on this in my lesson yesterday with, I think, the way John reforms the idea of Nikao or Nike, or being victorious. There's the Rome way of doing it with power and might and impressiveness. And then he says, but our way is a different way. It's the way of the Lamb. And I think it's really easy to lose sight of that. There are really two options for the people of God as a way of life, as a shape of life. One is persecution. The Bible in several places is like, if you follow Jesus, you will be persecuted. Embrace that. It doesn't mean we're always going to be persecuted, but I think if we're living the Christ-centered life, we will be persecuted. And then the other option is sacrificing, and usually for the most vulnerable. So we're either we're always going to be losing, in a sense. It's either persecution or sacrifice. There's no sense of like power and winning and might and those sorts of things. So when it wraps up with the fruit of the Spirit, I mean, that's what our walk is okay. This is really the last thing I'm going to say. I just pulled an old pastor trick there where I've now had two last things. But I think it's the difference between image bearing and sin management, where we're not really called to turn Christianity into a sin management, stop, no, don't. And then we define our walk with Christ by what we don't do anymore. But instead, it's becoming like Christ. It's having the mind of Christ, being formed into the thinking of Christ. That's our goal.
Yeah, I just happened across a book. I can't remember the name of it, but it's based on Dallas Willard's. I think it's chapter 9 of his what was that, Fruit book? That's based on the Sermon on the Mount. But it kind of goes along the same lines. Which
Divine Conspiracy, are you talking about?
Yes, exactly, that one. I think in chapter 9, he talks a lot about, what it would look like. And then one of his compatriots was like, okay, I'm going to write a book that kind of delves into that. So, no, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on Simone's question about Rome in our hearts and taking on the ways of the lambs as individuals? Damon?
Yeah. So first you have to recognize where the ways of Rome or empire exist in your life by doing just like periodic survey of your own self, of your own heart. You got to be able to be really honest with yourself. You got to go looking for it, because if it's a pattern, you probably don't notice that you're in it. And so you have to get the input of other people, but you also have to just be willing to do some honest soul searching of your own. And then once you find those things, having the courage and the humility to wash them out,
to own it,
mm-hmm. And then take the courageous steps, because it's really scary to change.
It is.
First, to admit that you were wrong, and then to take the steps to change it. So, what I would say.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. Okay, I'll leave that alone. All right, so Verge has her question is, in hoping to unify our ministries, is this current environment, especially in the United States, since truth-telling must happen prior to reconciliation, how can we facilitate the truth-telling process? And I think maybe with that is an agreed understanding as to, what our discussion has been all about, as in the first step is making sure that, we're seeing Jesus and we're being conformed, to his image, and we're living that faithful life. I don't know if that's necessarily agreed upon, in our churches as a whole. I mean, we can have that maybe a separate discussion, but Verge's question is, how can we facilitate the truth-telling process? Ivy?
I think for me, the first thing that I have to ask myself before I expect, an overall change, again, what Damon talked about, the self-assessment, but I think for me, it's asking myself, like, am I safe? Am I a safe person? Can someone come to me and tell the truth without fear of being ostracized or put in a box in some way, marginalized, which, many of us have experienced and seen in different circles. And so for me, that's really the first step. Am I a safe person? What's keeping me from being a safe person? What am I telling myself that I'm protecting? And what keeps me unsafe to others? And then you work outward from there.
And if you're in a position of leadership, then you create that culture amongst the rest of the congregation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Kevin, any thoughts?
Hi, Verge. I could spend all day on this, but I won't. It is.
Yeah,
I think
you can also share a little bit about what the Seeking Justice is about too. I think that would be helpful.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. So it's great having Verge as a part of that group. So over the past several years here in the States, there's obviously been unprecedented unrest, and what it exposed, at least from my vantage point, having been a part of our churches for over 4 decades is there is a great amount of unity and a great amount of diversity, actually much more than most Christian groups and different other denominations or faith communities. And yet there was a sort of surface tacit unity. But beneath that, there are different conceptions of truth that we hold. And so I think it exposed those different conceptions of truth in our churches. And to Virgil's question, I think we've got to accept that we are uncomfortable with certain, in certain areas of being 100% truthful. I think we've become more accustomed to sort of a surface level diversity, but not a deep gut level. What is your experience really like? What do you really feel? Harkening back to what Nadine shared just before the panel. So some of us in the United States are part of a group called Christians Seeking Justice. And it came from just being inspired by the Let Justice Roll conference back in 2021, the events of 2020 and following, and understanding that there are so many passages in the Bible about justice, around justice. And yet, in many ways, that topic or that tenet of God's heart has been neglected in our formative training, at least in this fellowship. I don't remember prior to 2021 even hearing a message in all my years on justice. And yet, you know, the prophets, Jesus, are just you can't avoid it when you're really looking for it. And so we formed this group. We're holding conferences. We had a conference called Jesus and Justice back last fall, and Michael Burns was one of our keynote speakers, in addition to Professor Soong-Chan Rah. And you know, that I think that even made a space for people to have the conversation. Honestly, we've got great squad efforts in many of our churches, but I would say many of them as well have found it to be frustrating in the sense that it's not been necessarily a church-wide, member-wide embrace of dealing with issues around justice specifically, and also racial justice. So we've tried to create a community that is insisting on that conversation happening and encouraging it rather than waiting on the church to be comfortable. I think many church leaderships they're just not comfortable going there because we've never gone there in our 40-year history. So, and I'll say this too, we have a conference coming up. Is this okay for a shameless plug? I don't know if it is, or I've already put it out there.
As long as it's shameless.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have a conference coming up in October of this year in Atlanta. Fortunate to be being hosted by the Bridgepoint Church of Christ in Marietta. And it's called Jesus and Justice. And we've got a couple of speakers. We've got Dr. or Professor Jamar Tisby, and also Professor David Gush. I've never heard his name. I've read his name, but I've never heard his name pronounced. So I might be saying it wrong, Gushee. But he's a professor at Mercer University in Atlanta and a friend of Dave Podka, I think, is one of his students, as was Ben Barnett, one of the doctoral students. Anyway, so we're having these renowned authors and Christian speakers speak to the need to get serious about dealing with areas of justice as Christians, as a part of telling truths that we have historically not engaged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know, just a note in the chat was also, I know many years back, South Africa had the Truth and Reconciliation. So I don't know, Neil, if there's anything you might want to share about truth telling and just your general thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think the reference to American churches, I can't really comment on that, but we've certainly had our issues. George Floyd event reverberated around the world. It was a perfect storm with COVID and not being able to really meet face to face. What helped us, and I do want to give a shout out for Michael. You all know him, but going through his, I think it was crossing the line. I think a 12-week or program our church went through, and we emphasized cultural humility, cultural awareness, just asking lots of questions. We started with our leadership group. It took a few months. Some of our leadership group, it was very diverse at that time, didn't feel, comfortable to share, but we persevered. There were one-on-one discussions. As an older white guy, I learned a lot. I just decided to listen and to hear the hurts and how a lot of our Black members were raised and taught by their parents that they're inferior and they've got to be careful the way they speak to white people and so on and so forth. This was well after apartheid. So it was not an easy process. And I'm not saying it was done perfectly, but I always remind people we did it. We did something. And I think, but generally it was beneficial. I think in terms of truth telling, I'm not sure I understand the term properly, but we encourage people to speak, freely. There were a few concerns about church, particularly how we did things, how we assumed this was the best way to do church. Obviously, the dominant culture, even though we're a minority white church, some of our church practices reflected more of a Western culture. So just understanding the Western and Eastern culture. So we had some really great discussions, but it helped us to actually follow a program. Michael, if I remember correctly, zoomed in. We had Gilbert Kimeng from Nigeria, a great teacher, guiding and facilitating as well. So for about 3 to 4 months, it was quite an intensive process, but it was beneficial. I don't think these processes are ever complete or they're ever perfect, but we do have, I think, a healthier culture where people can speak. I have, just as a church leader, a few mature Black guys who, speaking to my life, I ask them for advice, and I can ask silly questions that don't sort of, trigger. We have that relationship, and I think ultimately it's all about relationship, just being friends, wanting to learn from each other, being humble, asking questions. But I think cultural humility and just cultural awareness was something we really needed to do better. You would think that with our history and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as you say, Otoma, and what we'd been through, that we would have perhaps known better as a society, but we're still very divided, sadly. But yeah, I can't speak for America specifically. I think your issues are maybe not exactly the same. But it just needs to be an ongoing process and allow people to speak one-on-one in forums. But yeah, it helped us. In hindsight, it was a good thing. The triggers that happened, and it forced us as a church to deal with things that we as leaders weren't even aware of, to tell you the truth. So big topic, ongoing process. We'll never be perfect, but at least I think we've created an openness and trust for people to speak about issues. And my wife and I, Nolene, my wife in particular, is amazing in terms of just listening to people and being willing to empathize and change. So sorry for the long answer, but yeah, it's really important ongoing issue and challenge.
It sounds like you created some pockets of tove right there, as we learned earlier today. So thank you for that. One thing that at least we're trying to do in Image Bearers is trying to at least reflect on Jesus through the year, and hence the conference today. And I didn't know if you guys have anything you're doing liturgically in your ministries or anything like that, because it seems like it's like the Sunday school answer, right? What's the answer? Jesus. What's the answer to what ails us? It's Jesus. That's the answer. So is there anything that you guys can share that you're doing? I think, the culture humility, I think that's awesome. I think the conference is something that's been mentioned. Are there any other things that you guys are doing that I think, if I remember correctly, I think you guys went through either 2 Corinthians or 1 Corinthians in Dallas. But if there's anything else that you guys would like to share that you found helpful, and even if you'd like to share, Michael, about, that study and how you notice an impact from that, that would be helpful too.
I'll go after Ivy.
Go ahead, Damon.
Okay. 4 months of conversation and lessons on spirituality, how to define spirituality, the importance of spirituality, and how it shapes the way we think and the way we behave. It's what we've been doing, and I think the fruit of it has been pretty evident just in the air around the congregation and the way we explain and define some of the challenges that we find ourselves in, rather than trying to find the next fix or the next lesson or the next 3-step program to turn things around. We're just trying to define things as, well, that was a spiritual response, or that was a not very spiritual response. And why wasn't I very spiritual? There's a cause for it.
Okay. So you guys had, you were studying through the Gospels on that, or did you have something that you just put together? And just generally, how did you go about that?
Yeah, great question. It's more of a topical study. We did some Henry Nouwen's book on spiritual formation, helped inform and help us shape some lessons. We went through lessons on spiritual disciplines. Then we've spent a particular section of time on how the spiritual discipline of prayer, that's what we've been in the last 3 weeks in a row here, affects our spirituality or lack thereof.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you. Anyone else like to share?
So we're fortunate in LA to have Byron Parsons. Some of you know of him. He wrote
That's where he is.
Yeah, he's fortunate. So quick bit of trivia. Byron and I went to college together, undergrad at HBCU, Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, Florida. He became a Christian in '82, our senior year. Anyway, so we're fortunate to have him, but he wrote a book called Abiding in Christ, and it's just a journal. And so we're having a class, like a traditional Sunday school class. It's not traditional actually, but Sunday school class where he's teaching it prior to our service, which is at 11 to 9:30 class, and just try to make space for the whole concept. Of course, he wrote the book Walking the Spirit Way, and so he's been one of the main, I would say, advocates for Holy Spirit-led living. But it is having Holy Spirit as the primary emphasis rather than discipleship. So that is a paradigm shift, not exclusive of, it's both and versus either or, but shifting the primacy. And so having that class is something that we've just begun, but just creating ongoing space for that. So that's one of the things that I could share. Yeah. And I'd highly recommend the book, the journal. It's our staff, by the way, he took our staff through it. And then, all those that want to attend. So that's a feature we're offering even as we're shifting in our church to the next generation. And, some younger people doing most of the public, Amir Burton doing the main public speaking, and the older generation sort of shifting and trying to hold their arms up. But we're offering this class as well. So we cover, the generations and just, we're in it for the long haul, trying to make the shift, the mind shift.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Tom, I'll jump in here quick and just kind of highlight. I'll focus in on what we've been doing on the Icon podcast over the last year or two. Our theme or our tagline for the podcast is trained readers reflecting Jesus. And I often add to that because, taglines have to be short, that we're trying to be trained readers reflecting Jesus. It's not that we have that all figured out, but we've kind of been going through an intentional process there where a couple of seasons ago, we started with the book of Mark, and we went through that, looking at the life of Christ and the message of the way of the cross, specifically focusing on that. And then after that, we did a season on Ephesians and what it looks like to live that out practically and work through the divisions and differences that we have, and in this cosmic battle that we are facing against the powers and authorities who want to keep us divided. And then we finished a season at the end of last year where we went through the book of Revelation and saw how Jesus is the king of this cosmic battle, leading the fight against empire and the ways of empire, and calling the church to be an alternate witness to that. And then we kind of picked up where Revelation leaves off, and this season we're looking at new creation and what it looks like to be a Jesus people, living out the new creation that came through the life of Christ, and that we're embodying, but also anticipating and looking forward to. And we're trying to be really practical with that. Like we start out pretty theoretical, like we went through Genesis and talked about how to get the story of creation right, because if you have the anthropology and the soteriology of creation wrong, then that impacts what we think Jesus came to do. So we're getting that right, and now we're going through right now new creation as a theme in the Gospels, and eventually we're going to get really practical and talk about, like, what does it look like to live out new creation in marriage and as parents and a job and in racial justice and economic justice and all of those sorts of things. Like, what does new creation look like? So that's where we're going the rest of this season.
While you're still on the screen, Michael, question for you, and I'll be likely asking this quite a bit. Page 267, if I remember correctly, or 276, I don't know. But of Escaping the Beast, you had I think this beautiful picture of what a church could look like that is living out the Sermon on the Mount, specifically, maybe paying it forward for people's, education, those that may not be able to afford it, or buying cars for disciples that are not able to, and just different things like that. So I don't know if there's more that you might be privy to as far as individuals or churches. And again, I know you don't know everything, but just that you may have got feedback on as far as, like, how that impact, what you've seen churches or individuals doing on that realm.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I have a great answer, because I think, there are different churches doing different aspects of that work. I don't think any one church can do it all, but
Sure.
There's some great things that I've seen. The Philadelphia Church and ODAT and the work that they do, One Day at a Time, is a group there started by a disciple in the Philadelphia Church, and they focus particularly on economic justice and drug rehabilitation and things like that. And they're just doing amazing work. And I think of the Potomac Valley Church and the things that they're doing, and they really think through.
Wow. Yeah.
The Fox Valley Church does this water walk every year. I hope you're still doing that as I say that, because it seems like you've been doing that for years. I love that. And so, they've taken on an aspect of that. And even, although I'm still fairly new to Dallas, in the particular region that I'm in, I work with all the regions, but the particular region I'm in, we're focusing this year, coincidentally, as well, a theme on new creation and what that looks like and ways that we can implement that in the community. And so we're, everything from being better stewards of the environment to working, with prisoners and helping economic situations and all of that. I think the temptation is to want to try to do it all. And I don't think we can do that, but certainly not as individuals, but as a body of Christ. I think it's, we can come much closer to that. But I think it's really good that you ask that question. I encourage everyone to keep asking that question, because the more you ask it, the more you'll find out things going on that you didn't know, and places that are doing things. And then we can start to share ideas and information. And I think in this realm, stealing is a really good thing, like steal ideas and
This is where it's okay to steal. That's awesome. Thank you.
And they're doing some great things in Southern Africa, South Africa. They've,
Oh, yes.
both Port Elizabeth and Durban, they've done some amazing things there with early childhood development and families who are economically disadvantaged, and they've done some wonderful things there as well. So there is a lot going on. You just don't tend to hear about those things. We're in a time right now where we tend to focus on the negative, and that gets more airplay and attention. But there's, the Spirit's doing a lot around the world.
No, thank you. Last question, I guess, for me, unless you guys had questions of each other, and we can go with that briefly. But we are going to try to wrap up here at 3:45. What do you feel like we're doing well in terms of in general, living for Jesus, obviously, but what do you feel we need to work on? And I know it could be like 1,000 things, but like, what's the main thing you feel we need to work on that would be most beneficial in taking us to the next level in terms of, either just depending on God, being conformed to Christ, these kinds of things?
So I'll just ask a clarifying question. Are you referring more on an individual basis for us personally, or in the people that are watching, or are you talking about like our family of churches?
Family of churches, more specifically.
I can answer quickly. I think we're evaluating ourselves. Great.
This is true.
It's no longer viewed as controversial to be asking questions about what we could do better as a fellowship of churches. So that's a great place to start. I fear we may get stuck there, if I'm being honest, and end up asking 1,000 questions about what we need to do better, and then get trapped. But I think for starters, the fact that it's okay to ask, where are we weak, is in fact the strength that I'm proud of in our fellowship of churches.
Yeah. I think going along with what Michael just shared, that oftentimes it's the things that we need to improve, is what we get stuck talking about. I would say if we could start anywhere, it would be assuming that we all want what's best, and we all are moving forward in the Spirit in the best possible way that we can. And then doing that in humility, because the Spirit's going to reveal things along the way.
Differently to different people.
Right. And I think that instead of expecting a different kind of uniformity, like, oh, we're not all doing this, and so we're not okay. I think that goes, to me, it's just a different version of the old way. Instead of uniformity, the Spirit is looking for a unity, and we don't all come to that at the same time, but trusting the best in one another, I think, is critically important, because once we abandon that, then we also lose a part of the heart of Jesus. And so for me, I think that that's not just where I need to start individually, but it's also what I need to call other people to.
No, thank you. Yeah, I guess myself personally, I guess I can just share. I sometimes think that, I guess I wrestle with the concept of Paul saying, this is what I teach in all my churches. So there was something that was consistent, unless I misunderstand the passage, But at the same time, where Jesus says, "Oh, you know what? Don't worry about them. As long as they are not cursing my name, so to speak." I'm paraphrasing. Then no problem. And I think I don't know if there's a continuum or if I'm not quite understanding correctly.
That's a great, how you just put that was so well done, Atoma. You're a good man. So yeah, so it's interesting when you look at our history, there is this pull, this longing to have some uniformity, which has in some ways defined us, and not, it's been both good and problematic at times, right? So you want unity and not uniformity. So I'd say, since there is no Paul, right, this Jesus converted apostle who would seem to have the authority to, communicate with a broad group of churches as to how they should function. It seems to me, and this is just, it's one of, I don't look at us as a monolith, and I think it feels to me that we should make room for, if we really are trying to be spirit-led people, we should make room for him leading different ones of us in different directions, where you've got, Damon and Ivy doing what the Spirit is leading them to do to the best of their ability where they are, as with Neil, as with Michael and others, and be okay with that, rather than longing for some nostalgia, right? Some spiritual nostalgia of, we all used to either sing the same songs or whatever. And we all too, as well, had similar blind spots. So I don't know. I think it's more getting comfortable with what binds us together, not being uniform practices as much as a shared love of Jesus and love for each other, and trusting that relational fabric, the one thing we agree on, right, being enough to bind us, rather than having to have our orthopraxy be similar. So I don't know if that helps, Atoma, but that is what I'd say the Spirit has told me. And being, even if you look at the New Covenant, what he led Paul to do, he's trying to go to, he wants to go to Asia, and the Spirit leads him to Macedonia, and he goes there and he leads Peter to a different group, and John's doing a different thing, and it's okay. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Well, I guess I don't disagree in any sense. I guess I was thinking more in the sense of, those who may say, well, I guess the best way to communicate it, we may look at them more politically, people need to figure out their own life, and yes, I'm a disciple, but I've got to this point. I don't know, not a compassion, I guess, is for those who are going through challenges.
Oh, okay.
If you go back, this may be, for example, like, you know what, I'm not going to wear a mask or whatever.
Right.
And it's like, so that's more what I'm, I guess, looking at. I'm very excited that everyone has differences and, does different things. I'm not expecting that prison ministry needs to be in all churches necessarily. It's just different. Right. But those that may be, in a sense, shaped a different way, that's the best way I can state it. Yeah. Not to go too long, but that's, if anyone has a quick thought on that, that's fine. But that was more what I was, and how to wrestle with that. And I guess either be okay with that, or is that something we should be looking at as a church and as an overarching, hey. And I guess I think, just to be clear, I think about it more like the Quakers. So there was a point the Quakers were probably all over the place, right? And then they said, you know what, we're going to work on slavery. This is something like all of us collectively. So there was a uniformity to that. So.
Well, I think there's a way to do that, but it's about the spirit of it to me. Does your gathering, creating a place where any church in any condition feels we are connected by the blood of Jesus and our shared history. And to Ivy's earlier point, we give each other the benefit of the doubt that all of us are trying to the best of our limited ability to be who God wants us to be. Gathering around that premise and making space for where people are wherever. And so if there's someone that's hurting, or if there's a need that we could collectively rally around, then that would come to the fore. But not having a predefined agenda. We're going to gather so that someone can say we all need to do this month, right? That's a different MO than we want to gather to celebrate God's, the new creation that we're part of, and God's family here that we're a part of. And let's even find out what's going on in different places. To Michael's earlier point, that would be a worthwhile gathering, just to know, just to don't assume. It's just, I don't know, so I agree with that, Atoma, for sure. I think it's all about the spirit with which we gather, the purpose of it. So as opposed to outcome control or quality control, so to speak, but more of, you're in the family. Jesus died for you. We love you. That's not on, it's not, you do something, you're going to be off the island, that spirit, right? And obviously heresy and stuff like that, we all know. I'm just saying a spirit of acceptance without agreement on every issue. That's me. Okay. That's enough. Said enough.
Did you want to say something briefly, Michael?
No, I think that was well said. I don't think I can add anything to what Damon, Ivy, and Kevin just said. My answer would have been similar.
Okay, I just saw you.
Yeah, I was stretching my hand, and then I realized I was like, man, that's going to look like I was raising my hand, but it was too late. The die was already cast.
All right. Okay, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up right here. And we are going to resume in a few minutes here, 3:50, to just recognize a few folk amongst us who can inspire us amongst you guys already to continue to be image bearers for God. Thank you.
Thank you.